I think many people, when they think about developing IP, are thinking we're talking about tech companies. We're talking about companies that are in technology. And I guess I wanted right at the beginning to disabuse people of that idea. It's way more than tech companies. We're not, in fact, we're not just talking about the new stuff, the innovation that's coming in with companies. We're talking really about the most established companies in the country have significant amounts of IP. They may not recognize it that way, but when we're talking about processes, data, know-how, just know-how, formulas, organizational structures, and market research. I mean, all of these things that even companies in very staid industries will have that. Those are protectable assets, and therefore they have value. So it's important when we think about value creation. Some of these companies that might be regarded as old enterprises, in fact, have significant IP that requires protection. So I think that the scope of Lewis's comments really go well beyond our Silicon Valley and the tech industries here.
When you've served on many diverse boards that have a lot of really IP-centric knowledge about this, was there anything that you felt as a board member when you were trying to challenge the executives or just give the oversight you were supposed to? What were your leading things that you really cared that you wanted them to understand or at least look into? How did you view that as a board member?
I think, you don't typically talk about intellectual property, as I said, a lot as a board. It's not one of the subjects that is on most board agendas. And you don't want to be a squeaky wheel who's bringing it up at inappropriate times. And so the question is, how do you bring it up? And how do you make it a business discussion rather than just a legal discussion? And how do you think about it? And in different companies, it's going to be different. In companies that have a significant R&D group and are developing new products, the strategy should be around, hey, we're spending a lot of money on R&D or product development. What are we doing to protect both the people, as you talked about? If we have phenomenal scientists who are doing most of the innovation in the company, how are we thinking about them? And it even ties into compensation. A lot of companies, if folks develop a great new product or know-how or new process or new patents, how are we thinking about that from a compensation plan perspective? When we are doing acquisitions, how much time do we spend on the IP and both the team that may have the know-how, as you talked about, as well as what assets they have in the way of patents and trademarks. And I think you have to find ways to bring it up without making it just a legal matter and to tie it into the business. But I don't know any businesses that aren't trying to innovate. And I think intellectual property and new product development and new process development and new service development is intellectual property. And so whether you call it that or not, it's what are we doing to protect the ways that we're innovating and creating value in our company? And so I think tying it into the bigger picture is very, very important.
I think most of the time companies are generating IP all the time. When you take your money and you build, you invested in R&D or invested in your people are extremely important, and they're creating stuff all day long. We like to call that generally know-how or know not how. It's equally important to know what doesn't work as it is what works. But somebody has to go through that process of knowing what works or what doesn't work. The challenge that companies have today, for example, we have at AM, we have a perfectly great trade secret theft policy. Okay, the challenge that companies are having today is that they are not taking care of their intangible assets as well as they should. We go and we say, hey, we'd like to offer you a trade secret theft policy. Are you worried about trade secret theft? Absolutely. Okay, so all we need for this policy is for you to tell us what trade secrets you have. You would think that would be a very easy exercise. It turns out it's not. Most companies have no idea what trade secrets they have. They have an idea of kind of their competitive advantages, but they've never taken time to catalog them. I've really only met a few companies in all the years I've been doing this that have done a great job of cataloging their trade secrets. And the reason for it, 3M being one of them, the reason for it is they've gotten sued or they've tried to sue for trade secret theft. And anytime you try to sue for trade secret theft, you will normally lose at first because you haven't done a good job of pre-doing it. So if somebody walks out the door and they take a trade secret and you go, hey, they stole my trade secret, the first thing you're going to encounter in court is, how do you know it's a trade secret? What did you do? What would you do about that? Simply locking down visitors so they can't wander around isn't really enough, right? If it's available. So there's going to be some practice changes, to Dan's point, that companies are throwing off IP all day long, but we haven't organized ourselves quite well enough to do that. And that's not just a legal function. That's actually a function through the lifeblood of the whole organization. It's a cultural thing of how do you understand that this is intangible assets. This makes my company's stock more valuable if I do things this way.
One of the real impediments to getting management's attention on these issues has been the inadequacy of our accounting policies for intangible property. It's really a problem because I don't think managers recognize what Louis was saying earlier, that 85% of the value is often in these intangibles. And they're used to looking at a balance sheet, and it's not on the balance sheet. And in fact, I don't know, Louis, if you've said this before and if you were just kidding, but I mean, really, one of the quick ways to measure the value of intellectual property is simply look at the market cap of a company and deduct from that the book value that's on the books. And you see, I mean, it's enormous. Well, so we're missing a great deal of the value of the company, and trying to get some traction when you're talking to the business community about the importance of this issue is really hampered by our inability, really, I say this for the accounting profession, to come up with appropriate measuring yardsticks to help us size the importance of this issue.
As you do a lot of work on the governance side, is there ways that boards should be thinking about organizing themselves to handle these types of this asset class that's emerging? Is it an all board issue, or is it a subcommittee? I mean, how would you think about this if you were starting to organize or modernize boards today for an intangible rich economy?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, issues such as cybersecurity, which deals exclusively with intangible assets, that's a topic that has been bounced from one committee to another within companies as to who has responsibility on the board for that topic. I've seen so many different approaches to that, and none is the right one, other than to say this is a highly important issue, and ultimately the board bears responsibility for it, and the board bears responsibility if it doesn't handle it itself to make sure that the committee or group that is designated with that responsibility reports regularly to the board, so that everybody really has a good understanding of how the company is handling the risk presented by cybersecurity attacks. So the same thing is true really of this issue with intangibles and how the company is handling intangibles. I would not assign that to the entire board. I think that really makes no sense. But for what it's worth, our audit committees in public companies these days have a workload that is it's overpowering. There's so many topics that are put on their shoulders. I really do believe that it would be appropriate to designate a different committee, whether it's specially formed for this or a committee that handles the issues surrounding intangible assets. And there are a lot of them. I mean, there are, cyber would be one of those topics that's included within the purview of that committee, but also would be looking at infringement issues and the destruction of value by disclosure of trade secrets and monitoring who in the company is following that and what recent incidents have occurred and what is the discipline and within the company for following up on these violations. and auditing, periodic auditing. So I think the board's role here is oversight of this area, and I do believe it should be delegated to a specific committee rather than taken on by the board as a whole.
A couple questions on valuation that I thought were really good in terms of both, can there really be one valuation that everyone agrees to? And you know, for me, the value is to some extent in the eye of the beholder. You know, I spent a lot of time in my career in M&A, both on the buyer side and on the seller side. And it really depends. If I'm a company that's used to selling widgets and now I've decided that my internal product innovation folks are saying that the future is in three-legged stools, then I'm going to have to go into that market, and suddenly I'm going to care very much about it, and I'm going to care very much about who has the IP there, and suddenly that IP is going to be valuable to me because that whole area is going to be valuable to me. And so you're absolutely right. Who values it and how the market values it is determined on if I have, as a company, have decided I'm going to go into a new industry or new area that I haven't, then I value it very, very much. And I'm going to want to go negotiate with that company to either acquire or license their IP. And therefore, suddenly the value of that portfolio goes up. So you're right. You can't, everyone is not going to value IP exactly the same, which is what's tricky about it. But what we can say, and in the case of new industries or new areas of innovation, we can say, wow, autonomy, robotics, and AI are happening in a huge way. It's very clear this is a booming market. It's very clear there's a lot of money going into funding companies. It's very clear large companies are investing heavily in it. So one can probably assume that IP in those industries is going to be very valuable. Where industries that are not growing, that are very mature, that don't have a revenue growth rate, perhaps the IP is not going to be as valuable. But there is nuance to it, absolutely. And there are different models, and you have to look at the market. And as Louis said, you know, how many buyers are in that market and how many companies are planning to go into that space, and who has developed the most robust IP portfolio is very important.